Hi, my name is Denise Busing, and I was a sergeant in the United States Air Force from 1989 to 1992. I was stationed at McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey. I joined the military because I grew up in a family that strongly believed in the military and protecting the United States of America. My grandfather was in the Army during World War II. My father was in the Air Force and the Marines during the Korean and Vietnam Wars. McGuire Air Force Base is a military airlift command base, and my job was the office administrator to the commander of the supply squadron. I mainly processed personnel paperwork and ran reports for the commander. The supply squadron was a large warehouse full of various supplies from all types of parts, hardware, electrical items, and large items like air conditioners and tires. The base fuels department was under the supply squadron. The fuels department is like a very large gas station for the planes. The fuel was loaded by tankers, and the tankers would fuel the planes. There was an accounting department that kept track of the inventory, the fuel inventory, and the expenses. Part of my job I ran for the commander were weekly accounting reports on the fuel inventory. The supply squadron also managed the explosive ordnance disposal team. They were called out to disarm weapons and explosives. I always thought this was an interesting job in the military. However, my job wasn't involved with this team. There's one defining moment I experienced in the Air Force that made me realize what being in the military ultimately meant. I had won a trip and was awarded a spot as a crew member on the Air Force's second largest cargo plane. The trip was a 7-day trip to 5 different countries. One of these countries was Turkey. 5 of us crew members had walked downtown Incirlik, Turkey for dinner and shopping. As we turned a corner, there were 2 Turkish military members holding machine guns. They followed our group until we had entered a restaurant. This was the reality of military life in other countries, a first-time experience for me. And at a young age of 19, that solidified my love for our country, and I soon had the highest respect for our military. I knew I didn't want to live in any other country but the United States of America. During my enlistment in the Air Force, the country of Iraq attempted to occupy its neighboring country, Kuwait. In response and support of Kuwait, President Bush increased U.S. military troops and resources to the Persian Gulf. This military operation was called Operation Desert Shield. Operation Desert Shield soon became Desert Storm. The Persian Gulf War waged by coalition forces from 35 nations and was led by the United States of America. It was the war against Iraq in response to Iraq's invasion and annexation of Kuwait. As soon as Operation Desert Shield started, our job duties on base began to change from our daily base supply support to mass staging of equipment and supplies. These equipment and supplies were being packaged and shipped to those troops in Kuwait. Being on a military airlift command base meant that our cargo planes were loaded with everything that our troops needed to live and operate in the desert. Essentially, the troops used these supplies to build smaller versions of bases. These bases were fully functional little towns with barracks for the troops to sleep in, a dining hall, a medical tent, and even a post office. Once Desert Storm started, my job was focused on receiving top-secret messages, retyping them into formats that were understandable by our various supply departments. The departments then knew exactly the type of part and quantity needed back in the desert. Many of the parts needed were for the guns and weapons used by the troops on the front lines. The main thing that kept me going during this wartime, and has stuck with me ever since, is the importance of a team that stands behind the same mission. It didn't matter what piece of the moving machine you were in the military. It took the smallest task of receiving and retyping those messages I was responsible for to the troops on the front line fighting for our freedom, to all the pieces in between that made that machine work. Each of our jobs depended upon one another. We all knew it, supported one another, and knew that each of our parts mattered to the mission of the United States Air Force.